So I want to talk to you guys about war crimes committed by Azeri soldiers in Nagorno-Karabakh. There were several stories that I read today, two stories actually, to be specific, and they were published by Human Rights Watch. And reading through these stories, I must say it's quite remarkable that they're being so ignored by the majority of people because these are war crimes committed by soldiers on civilians. And it's happening right in our own time. Because when we hear about, Turkish-backed soldiers, or when we hear about Azeri soldiers committing atrocities, and let's not forget, Azeris are Turks. Azeris consider themselves Turks. They know they're Turks. They identify as Turks. So when we read about Turkish soldiers killing civilians, we think of, well, something that happened back in World War I, something that happened back in 1915, 1917. But no, this is happening in our own time. This has happened in our own time. This happened back in 2020, not too long ago. And so I want to recount to you guys some of these stories. So in the first story, there was an elderly man and his wife, and they were living in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, Nagorno-Karabakh is a region that's technically in Azerbaijan, but for a very, very, very long time, it has been inhabited by ethnic Armenians. Back in the early 1990s, there was a war that took place between the Armenians and the Azeris, and they were fighting over this region. The Armenians defeated the Azeris, drove the Azeris out, and took it over. So in the war that took place in the fall of 2020, the Azeris were fighting off the Armenians and trying to take Nagorno-Karabakh for themselves. They both claim this territory for themselves. But historically speaking, Nagorno-Karabakh has always been inhabited by ethnic Armenians. So these ethnic Armenians, they were living in Nagorno-Karabakh, and you have this elderly couple, Armenian, living in this region. And the elderly man's daughter tells him, father, she tells her mother, come with me and my husband to Stepanakert. Now, Stepanakert is a city in Nagorno-Karabakh, but it's still inhabited by Armenians, regardless of the fact that the Armenians lost the last war, because in accordance to the peace treaty that was brokered by the Russians, Armenians are allowed to still live in Stepanakert. And a lot of the Armenians fled to Stepanakert after the war because it's still a refuge for them. So she tells her parents, come with me and my husband to Stepanakert. And the father, he's this, man in his 70s, and he's like, I was living in this village back in the 1990s, 30 years ago, when we were at war with the Azeris, and the Azeris never came to this region. They never came to this area. So they're not going to come to this area now. So the father has this very Eastern mentality, which is you never leave your area, right? And you will see this way of thinking throughout the entire Eastern world. It doesn't matter if you're in Eastern Europe or if you are in the Middle East. There is this idea that you never leave your home country. You always stay there. And so this old man has this, he's stuck in this manner of thinking. And he's saying, well, back in, 30 years ago when we were at war with the Azeris never came to our area. But that was back in the 1990s when the Azeris were still using old garbage military technology. Now the Azeris have very advanced NATO technology, and the Armenians are still stuck with old Russian weaponry. So the Azeris, the reason why, or at least one of the main reasons why the Azeris won, was because the Azeris just have better technology than the Armenians. Plus, they're also getting help from a very strong NATO member, Turkey. So the parents don't leave. They stay in their area in Nagorno-Karabakh. The daughter and her husband, they leave. And then the daughter's husband calls up his in-laws. He tries to call up his in-laws. The phone rings and rings and rings, and then someone picks up the phone. And it's not the father-in-law, it's not the mother-in-law, it's someone else. And the husband says, "Who is this?" And the guy says, "I'm Azerbaijani, and this is Azerbaijan." So Azeri soldiers had taken the parents, and they are now captive. The parents are now captives of the Azeri military. The Azeris take this elderly couple to some logging site in the wilderness somewhere, and in this logging site, there are numerous other Armenian captives. They then take them to some house. They keep them locked up there for a day or so. Then they take them to some shed somewhere. And then eventually they take them to this house. It was originally inhabited by Armenians, but then the Azeris took it and started using it as a prison. And then eventually I think they took them to an internment cell or something like that. They kept them captive. And eventually they let the mother go, the elderly mother. They let her go after, forcing her to watch them beat up her husband. And when they were in the logging site, she would watch as her husband was beaten over and over again. And she would start weeping and screaming, and the Azeri soldier grabbed her and said, "Don't worry, Granny, we don't kill elderly people." And they eventually let her go, and the old man, who didn't want to leave his village, was killed. The Azeris claimed that they did not kill this old man, that the man died of an asthma attack. But there was an autopsy that was done in Armenia, and the Armenians concluded that he was killed by a blunt injury to the brain. So they killed this man. Then there's another story that I read. It's a similar story. There are many Armenians who live in Russia because Russia is one of the countries that Armenians can go to without any sort of papers. So if you're an Armenian and you're living in Armenia, I would recommend that you get the hell out of Dodge before it's too late and go to Russia, because you can go to Russia, and you probably already know this. You can go to Russia without a visa, without any sort of papers. You go to Russia. So this man was living there. There was this Armenian man, and he was living in Moscow, and then he flew to Nagorno-Karabakh right before the outbreak of the conflict, and he met with his father and his mother, and he says, "Come to Moscow with me. Come to Moscow with me." And the father did the same thing as the other man. "I am not going to leave my village." Okay, fine. The son is now conflicted. Should I go back to Moscow or should I stay with my parents? And he concludes that he will stay with his parents because he would feel bad if he was in Russia where it's safe and his parents were in a war zone. So he stays with his parents. And one day he's outside in his town somewhere, and he sees an Azeri soldier. And he realizes they're here. So he runs all the way back to his father's house, and when he opens up the door, guess who's inside the house? 15 Azeri soldiers. And there is his father with his hands tied behind his back. The soldiers take him and his father, and now they're captives. And the mother and the sister were wondering where they were. The sister kept trying to call up her brother and her father, and no one was picking up the phone because they're captives now. So they were waiting and waiting and waiting to see any sort of sign that her brother and father were alive. And eventually there was a video that began to circulate in social media, and it was a video of the father being forced by Azeri soldiers to say that Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to Azerbaijan. And it was humiliating, but at least they knew the father was alive. And eventually the Azeris sent the old man back home. But they didn't send the son back home. And they were waiting for months to see whether or not the son would ever come back. And eventually there was a video that was found on social media, and it was a video of the son being forced to say that Karabakh belongs to Azerbaijan, and he was also being forced to insult the prime minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan. And so they were a little bit relieved because at that point they knew, oh, he's still alive, but they still didn't get him back. And eventually, some Russian peacekeeping soldiers found a bunch of bodies, and long and behold, well, not really behold, but they found the body of this young man with bullets in him. And you look at these stories, and there's a couple of things that I want to say about them. One, these particular events were preventable. The old man in the first story should have gone with his daughter. The old man in the second story should have gone with his son to Moscow. If they would have put away their tribalistic pride and their regionalist pride and gone with their children, these events would have never happened. That old man would have never lost his son if he would have just listened to his son. And that old man would have never been beaten to death. And his daughter, fatherless, if he would have just listened to his daughter and gone to Stepanakert. That's the first thing that I want to say. And secondly, the next thing that I want to say is that these are war crimes that are happening in our own times. And we're going to be hearing more and more stories like this in the future. And it makes you wonder, because people talk about the Holocaust, and they're like, well, how did the world just stand back and not do anything as this Holocaust was happening? Well, look at what's happening now. There's a Holocaust happening now. Turkey wants to kill all of the Christians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey wants to kill all the Christians in Armenia. There's a Holocaust being orchestrated as we speak. People are being killed. Nobody cares. So that answers that question. Never forget, right? That's what they say about the Holocaust. Never forget. Well, never forget is happening again. This is Theodore Schubot. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.